Well, it is our great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for today, our second keynote speaker for today, Bin Yu. Bin is a counselor's professor in the departments of statistics and of electrical engineer and computer science at University of California, Berkeley. Bin has a BS in mathematics from Peking University and a MS in statistics at University of California, Berkeley, and a PhD in statistics from University of California, Berkeley. Bin has been climbed the ladder extremely fast. In 1990, she was appointed assistant professor of statistics at University of Wisconsin in Madison. In 1993, she moved back to UC Berkeley as assistant professor, and there she was promoted to professor in 2001. She also chaired the department there from 2009 to 2012. Bin is a worldwide recognized statistician and a leader in data science. Her research is at the forefront of methodological development in the areas of statistical machine learning theory, methodologies, and algorithms for solving high-dimensional data problems. Her current research topics cover sparse modeling, like the lasso, structured sparsity, as hierarchical in group and graph path, analysis and methods for spectral clustering for indirect and direct graph, and remote sensing and social networks. Bin's work has been recognized by far by all the most prestigious scientific society. Just to name a few, she's a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, a fellow of the American Statistical Association. She was president of the Institute of Mathematical Statistics, fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a member of the National Academy of Science. So please join me to welcome Bin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisca and David, for having me. So it's very nice to be back to this building to look at the signatures again. So what I want to share is a lot of experiences my group and my colleagues in Berkeley have experienced in data science. And I will try to, I know we have a conference in data science, so nobody has been trying to define it. So let me try that. So the Berkeley definition of data science has three components: computer science, math and stats, and domain knowledge. And machine learning is this very active intersection of computer science and statistics. I want to just bring up two names to really justify why we say it's a re-emerging of computational and statistical inferential thinking. R.A. Fisher was a founding father of modern statistics. He was a geneticist at University of Cambridge. And I think most of you heard it. But there's a less well-known statistician who worked for U.S. Census 1890. That year, it was predicted that it would take 13 years for U.S. Census to finish its analysis. So Hallerith was charged to speed up the analysis of computation. As a result, he invented the Hallerith computing or tabulation machine. And he had a company way before all the startups and everything like that. And his company was one of the four that formed IBM. So this was a story that really, statistics in the most traditional sense, drove one type of computing device development. So now we're coming back together because it's hard to imagine computing without data and data without computing. So that's really data science. Of course, domain knowledge is very much embedded in the work of R.A. Fisher, who's never really a professor of statistics. I mean, officially, he was a professor of genetics. And if we zoom into machine learning and do a little analysis of why machine learning became so popular, really it was like it put prediction at the center and used cross-validation. And statistics, always, we did prediction, but if you think about statistics, traditional or classical statistics, you wouldn't think about prediction, you think about p-value or things like that, right? So somehow this simplification to one task of statistics really grabbed people's attention, made it so much simpler. And prediction is also a very important principle in science, right? If you think about Popperian philosophy of science, prediction is one way to falsify a hypothesis. And if you look at cross-validation, it's really also a pseudo kind of replication idea, right? Replication is a big idea in science again. If you have an invention or you have a discovery, you want to be replicated. And cross-validation, you try to use one data and use the argument about your understanding of the problem to say, hey, actually I can come up with 4 different pseudo-replicates and pretend that I have 4 different prediction problems, and then I can average. So it's really about replication. But the key, which is often forgotten, is that why can you do that? It's like from thin air, you now have 4 experiments. It's really the justification, the narrative, the social science bit of it, why makes things work and doesn't make things work. So let's not forget that we cannot just jump from thing and use notations, and that can be very dangerous. It's really the social science bit that we need to bring in to justify why we can do certain things and not to do some, which is not reflected in mathematical notations. You have to use natural language. So you have this prediction, cross-validation, super easy to understand conceptually and practically. And you have data, you have computers, and you have open software. So machine learning, like 20 years, really took off. Things have moved. Now interpretation is at frontier, right? We heard throughout the day, the need for interval machine learning. So my interest in interpretation actually came in through, as Francisca mentioned, I work a lot on LaSue and use it for neuroscience and try to get interpretation out of causal model out from predictive model. Realize that LaSue, L1 penalized squares, was very unstable when you try to look at it. You change the data bit, the predictor change. So it's better to do proper test set, but often we don't have the data, we still use cross-validation, which is still quite good to select regularization of trade-off parameters. But as an estimation of prediction error can be quite off. So there are 2 rows of cross-validation they shouldn't put together, right? You can have pretty off estimation, but the trend can be similar, can be good to the true prediction error, you can still use it. And EU 2 years ago had a regulation to say that, the users have a right to explanation. And we need to make our algorithms interpretable. So next slide, so don't jump. A case very close to home here is actually what's going on, the trial, I think, in Boston related to the unfairness, the lawsuit by the organization called Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard regarding whether there was unfair treatment of Asian Americans. So I don't understand the whole legal case, but what I looked at was actually statistical analysis. Both sides had experts. Interestingly, not by statisticians, by economic professors. Actually, the Harvard witness or expert was my colleague from Berkeley, whom I don't know personally, David Card. And the Harvard had a professor from Duke, C.D. O'Connell. So I took a very quick look. Each close to 200 pages, right? This statistics, but you can see statistics was a part of the evidence. I wouldn't say the whole. Which Professor Mina is still here to really look at the legal part. But if you look at the statistics analysis, is that it's not that easily interpretable if you think about this 200 pages, right? Even me, I'm trained as a statistician to cannot easily go through to make it something I can really say that's it. But if you look at the level that both use logistic regression models and kind of draw a bit causal conclusions, and that's problematic because that's observational study. And even you only care about association, I do see it's a piece of evidence. Association is a consequence of causation, so association evidence should be admitted. I can see that. But even that, you look at significant coefficients, that can be problematic because there are correlation between the covariates. And they also use different data. They both kind of really card-carrying applied statistician, I'll say. And Card's model use legacy athlete data, and the Duke expert doesn't. So I would personally agree that that's a different category of admission, the legacy athletes. And the other thing is going back to my cross-validation comment is that the predicted accuracy, it's called predicted accuracy in Card's report, it's actually fitted accuracy. So that's why we want to go to cross-validation or something close to test, is that as training error can really reward overfitting. I don't know in this case because I have to look at the data, but that's the thing, you cannot compare a model based only on training because you can fit things completely, get zero train, but it doesn't mean that you really get it, you fit into noise. So I decided to get something interpretable for me to look at something simple. So this is from Card's report, the Harvard witness. Both sides actually agree that the personal ratings by admission officers based only on files are lower for Asian American applicants relative to white applicants. But for alumni ratings, there was no difference. And you can see that for academic and extracurricular, it's the reverse, but for personal rating, the Asian students were rated lower. Actually, I was not really paying any attention to this matter until 2 years ago when one of my kids was college age. What grabbed my attention actually was this graph. It was 2013, that even before the lawsuit started. I thought that was really telling to me for me to pay attention to this. Was this graph is over 20 years of the top 2 lines. One, the dotted line, is the Asian age kids, college kids, going up, doubled. And the admission rate at all the Ivies, not just Harvard, capped at around 20%. And Caltech is the top line going up with it, just went up with the Asian applicants trend, right? So I'm just trying to say this is very interpretable information for me than all these 200-page reports, even I'm a statistician. And one thing is both reports also fit multiple models, right? So that's another thing I'll try to address. It's like each has multiple models. Like which one do you take? That's the usual problem now we face. And actually, I have a suggestion for the admissions office here is that we have statistical randomization. If you remove the names and redo the admission and just look at the percentage, right? That will really give some sense about the process. It doesn't say at the individual level, but at the population level, you have a very, I think, better than the regression analysis, what both sides seem to like. So coming back to stability is that each of these report, 200 pages, had used multiple models, right? And I wonder if they use deep learning, which is very popular, what will happen? So we do have this problem of too many choices for models. And even choices, you see the 2 sides use 2 different data, right? That's also a perturbation. So what I start working on this from neuroscience is really, can we bring back the robust statistics kind of consideration? I purposely didn't use robust statistics because robust statistics in statistics meant something quite specific about L1 and things like that. I tried to avoid that. So I chose stability, but it's really robustness. It's really try to integrate a body of work in the literature, statistics and machine learning, and have something very easy to explain to people that everybody understands stability. And I started with actually reproducibility with a lot of reports on false discoveries. I felt like stability had to be the prerequisite for interpretability, right? You don't want to interpret things when you change the data, the whole thing changed. It's a generalization of like statistical variability, but it's broader. And later I moved into causal inference, and I also been pushing predictability and stability together as like recommendation system for scientific experiments so that people can do experiments to verify. So I don't have time to go through that. You know, it's really try to unify a body of literature and move forward. The oldest can at least go back to jackknife in the 40s. So let me try to say it now, show 2 cases, how to use this. Stability principle, you have to decide what's your target of interest, which has a lot to do with your problem formulation. If it's prediction, stability and predictability are very much aligned. But we also want to think about the whole data science life cycle, not just the modeling part. Starting from problem formulation, data cleaning, and that occurred earlier, EDA, and then the models, algorithms. And also we might want to think synthetic data perturbation, not just perturb the data. And also ad hoc human decisions. We do a lot of things very ad hoc. We don't record it, we don't discuss it. So we should write it out and say that, does that influence our decision? And you have to decide what are the metrics. Wow, what's going on?
It's very unstable, you know.
It maybe it's testing me whether I can make it stabilize. Someone's going to help me to stabilize this. That's a good connection. I didn't say it, Xiaoli. Well, maybe you didn't. So how do we measure the instability? And one thing I want to emphasize, really pushing the thing to the social science domain, is this stability is the metric, why the perturbation makes sense, you need natural language to back it up. You cannot just say that, oh, it's x1 for xn, I do x prime, x1 prime, x2 prime, and I did it. What does that mean? You have to connect the symbols to reality. I taught statistics, I've been out for 30 years. For 25 years, I had no problem writing random variable in my early classes. Now I have a problem. I'm really worried about introducing probability notation without backing it up. So I actually push the introduction of random variables. Really doesn't like my talk, right? Just keep giving me instability to mid-semester. You think about it of a random variable. If you really care about the data at hand, you don't need random variable. If you want random variable, you're thinking about there's another possibility that another set of data could be observed now or in the future, in the past, that two data sets can be considered as realization of the same random variable. Otherwise, why would you bother? And implicitly, you're assuming stability. You assume there's another physical condition that things are kind of similar, except there's things are out of control, right? So you're really making some stability assumption when you introduce random variable. And subject knowledge, experience, and resource regulation, interpretability, all come into play. So it's really enterprise data science, not just science and computer science or statistics. It's also about social science. I was just saying that stability alone doesn't make sense because constant is very, very stable. Nobody wants it. So it's really like a second order consideration after you have some reality check. So in this talk, I'm using predictability as reality check. The threshold, what's good enough prediction error, is very subject dependent, or you have previous practice to say that that's the benchmark I want to use. And you could use other reality check, predict of multiple objectives. So the key is reality check. I've heard too many talks in statistics and machine learning. People talk about fitting, and people talk about even interpreting without showing me anything about the model actually fits anything. So that's an attempt to use machine learning to bring a goodness of fit back. The other thing I like this stability, more from education point of view, is I always find it very disturbing to teach statistics talking about true model, and later I tell the students actually the true model is not true. I think we should move away from the true model terminology, talk about approximations, and stability doesn't need a true. And central limit theorem and other mathematical theorems actually can be interpreted as stability results. So I think I lost some time. So let me just say, like, if you have weakly dependence, symmetric case, cross-validation, and the different forms of classical statistical perturbation will work here. But I want to introduce something else, which is you do data perturbation to enforce or add stability. For example, you could have a mechanistic model like from PDE, which you think simulate pretty good data, but not as real. But you want to use that to regularize your method or your result. The advantage of that is that you don't have to change your computing platform. You change your data. So that's a very powerful idea. You use data to regularize instead of penalties. And the adversary example in deep learning is very much kind of doing that. You find special examples and perturb data that one, so you add stability. And Tukey, I think one of the early data scientists, really was thinking about model perturbation. I mentioned that people fit multiple models. You can fit lasso and ridge. You can have different versions of deep learning. So we now really, modern time, with the ease of packages, we can fit lots and lots of models. And the question is, which one do we take? So put it together, I've been trying to advocate something I call PCS workflow, to really think about building on machine learning, predictability, reality check, computability, introduce stability, and adding also transparent documentation. That's where reality can be substantiated using subject matter and natural language. Otherwise, probability is only because you wrote it down. There's no reality check. Also, I want to advocate for this whole data science life cycle, that you have domain problem, and it's really a whole long pipeline. It's not just about model and fitting. And we should really consider all of this together as an entity instead of bits of it. And I argue that stability, even from the very beginning, domain problems formulation is there. Actually, in linguistics, there's something called linguistic stability. The meaning of a word, right? Classical statistics ML means maximum likelihood. Now it means machine learning, right? It's already there in our domain area. Two letters mean different things. So that's a paramount consideration. And computability, as soon as you start collecting data, you need some computing storage device. So I really think that we need to think the whole process and quality control every step, and robustness is a concern every step. I wrote a little blog at a website, a database called Data Wisdom for data science. It's really trying to articulate these different aspects through problems. And causality is very much in the back of my mind. I work a lot with biologists and neuroscientists. Science, basic science definitely is going after causality. And stability and predictability are consequences of causality. And we have been using in my group these two together to give recommendations for intervention experiments or for wet lab experiments. So add something more than just predictability. We know it's not causality. It's still not causality, but also causality we should think of as a whole spectrum instead of yes or no. It's really evidence building, and it's not exactly a yes-no question. So I want to illustrate PCS framework through two projects. The first one is with Ruizan Yuansi. Yuansi is actually in the back, so he will answer all the hard questions. And this project we finally submitted was like 3 or 4 years. I worked with Jake Lansdale, my long-term collaborator, and it's really tried to harness deep learning to do neuroscience. So visual pathway, which is we're kind of using modern technology, machine learning and statistics to do kind of classical physiology. We still look at single neuron. Next step is to look at population neurons. Visual pathway has two main information flow upward. One is what pathway, one is where. So V4 is a very elusive area in the what pathway. V1 is like edge detectors, location, orientation. On the other hand, you have all these feed-forward artificial networks, which are called deep learning. So I want to set the kind of standard through this very classical work by Hubble and Wiesel to see how they characterize V1 neurons. Is they have this sleepy cat with the eyelids popped up and looking at very synthetic stimuli on the screen and mapping the firing as sound. So it's very nice visualization. So they're shining light on the screen, and really you're hearing the firing rate of a particular neuron in V1 of a cat. So now you induce response. So this is intervention. So what we try to do is to come up with more naturalistic stimuli for the neuroscience to do experiment and be proven. Try also looking at the receptive field. So for the V4 area, people know that it's very complex. People have made out these geometric shapes to probe the V4 neuron, right? We know it somehow doesn't like simple stimuli, or most of them, but it's very difficult to come up with all possible complex shapes. And people also made different curvature and say, well, the V4 seems to like different. It's very geometrically made, right? But you can miss completely what they really care about. You're kind of shooting in the dark. Try this, see what happens. Try that. And Galan Lab is really a pioneer to use natural stimuli. So they collected V4 neuron from 2 behaving or 3 behaving macaques and put them together. We didn't tell the difference, we put them together. So you have natural stimuli. This was collected 10 years ago by one of the co-authors, Ben Wilmot, who spent 2 years to collect this data. So it's very expensive data, and not much has been published on the V4 property on this data. We had earlier work, which used a different path, still being written because the neuroscience writing standard is a lot higher. And there's parallel development in DiCarlos at MIT. Actually, we're visiting them tomorrow to hope to start a collaboration to try this out. They use this type of images, not exactly natural, but semi-natural, because they have objects imposed on top of natural background. So it's a little easier. And they did very good predictive work. We kind of validated or like independent replicated the work. And we have been going after interpretation for the last 2 years. So we've tried to answer, what do V4 neurons do? Remember the Hubble-Wiesel example is try to find stimuli that the neurons will get excited. Let's use that tradition. And also indirectly, we learned some evidence on this convolutional network somehow resemble the early visual cortex of primates. Technically, we're doing some transfer learning because we really use model trained on very different data and connect with neuroscience data. So what we did was ever heard of it? ImageNet is about 14 million images. Humans label them into about 1,000 categories, but most time people use about 10% of that to train these deep learning networks, which you heard about earlier. And the most famous ones like AlexNet, there's also GoogleNet and VGG. So what we did was that this is human, very high level classification task and colored. If this pipeline have some resemblance to primate visual cortex, we can transport that transformation and use our data and get processing and do some simple stuff and match with our neural activities. That's what we did. So we took whatever completely trained on completely separate task, human data, here is macaque data, small primates, and we put black and white images, had nothing to do with the training. We just made 3 channels, the same intensity, and extract the features, and we just use very simple method, linear regression, to predict the neural activities. Remember we had the earlier work, that's where we set the benchmark. We did this later, and actually did better, slightly better. So we were kind of very impressed, right? Because we worked very, very hard for the other simpler model, use our data we have, and this is really borrowed. So if you look at it, you can take different layers to do this. So after layer 2, things pretty much predictively do very similarly. But if you only do like Gabor, like what this guy did in the 50s, like edge detector, that's the purple, you definitely do better. So it says that if you only use simple Gabor-like things, it won't work. But other than that, there are many, many, many models will do very similarly predictively. This is one particular neuron on the test set. So the test set, we have about 10 replicates. So it's high signal-to-noise ratio. You have 3 models with Lasso as the regression. You have AlexNet, GoogleNet, and VGG. They're basically on top of each other, correlation 0.92. So you cannot tell them apart based on prediction error. And you can take layer 3, layer 4. And then you have regression, Lasso or Ridge. And you have 3 different architecture. So we end up with 18 models. Remember I mentioned for the lawsuit, people did multiple models and somehow chose one to interpret that. We had the same problem. We had 18 models and do equally well prediction. So we decided to invoke the stability principle to say that let's just be conservative, that we're only going to interpret the features, whatever we're going to do, if they're consistent with each other. Right? You follow stability principle, you can easily end up with nothing. But for science, it's not a bad thing right now because people have too many things, right? So if people don't want pledge to stability principle, they don't want to end up with null model, they will think much more carefully about what model they're going to try. Now people just try anything they want and they pick something. That's often overfitting. But if they pledge to stability principle, they know they're going to end up with nothing, they will really argue, oh, I should choose this type of model. So this really try to put some boundaries for people to think more carefully what model they use. And what we decided to do is to take what we call deep tune. It's kind of borrowed the deep dream idea that we have now a model. We're going to just start from white noise and maximize the surface and see what end up with. And we did multiple random starting point. For this neuron, this model, this is a different way of looking. It's called superheat to look at high dimensional data. And in the journal, you have to do the lower part because the movie cannot be in a journal yet. And you see that it always ends up with this curvature type of stimuli, suggesting that this neuron likes curvature. Remember, we have 18 models. If you do that for 18 models, you end up with 18 deep tune images. It's possible that this neuron actually likes a lot of things and might be happy with all of them. We don't know, right? So now we have a collection of stimuli, which are a lot more naturalistic than these geometric shapes to probe the neuron. And we also did compression. There's another project with Visa showing that for deep nets, if you want to put it on a small device, you want to shrink it and compress it. So you can see that we can remove about 70% of the filters, the nodes. You still see this curvature. So that's another perturbation to say that this is many, many models again, right? So it seems to be there. You look at the data. You look at the model, and you look at the data in our small database to see what images make this model big for this very constrained space, you see curvature. So we try to find evidence that we're not seeing illusion, we're actually seeing something. And this is based on your model, it's true. So if you look at the original test data, and you look at, this has nothing to do with the model, you look at the high peak, you still see some curvature, right? So we just try to bring some evidence, these deep tune images are not illusionary. Instead, it's actually capture some reality. And then remember this 18, right? People are just not too happy. So what should I look at? For us, we look at this for like a year or two and say, well, we see the curvature. But people say that, well, you have these eyes, this Google Lens. Why should I not look at that? Right? You have to look at holistically all the 18 to see it's only the curvature. But that's kind of not automated, right? Human will have to do that. So we worked on to get one image out we call consensus deep tune. Remember I talked about stability metric? So for this, actually, we use stability metric through the gradient, right? We heard that gradient is very, very important for deep learning. So you have 18 models you want to maximize. You take the slowest ascent direction, and you move that way. And this way, you get one image instead of 18 of them. This is 10 random initializations. They're pretty consistent now, right? They really removed all the little details and really focus on, it's kind of crowdsourced, this is the agreement, that is the curvature. So this now can be fed back if the electrode is still in there to see whether you heard that sound. If you put it there, the neuron fires, that's a proof that this neuron likes this type of image. It doesn't say that this is all they care about, but Hubble and Weasel experiment didn't really answer that question either, right? What are the other images? So it's very much follow that train of thought that we can do these experiments. So use this consensus deep train, now we can manually classify this 71 neuron to say that how rich the features that the neurons care about. So we classify as bob-like, corner-like, curve contours, lines. So the lines like V1 neurons, but with higher, bigger receptive fields, and complex pattern, we just don't know how to call them. So things like this, it's very hard to use geometric way to generate. Right? So we have naturalistic stimuli to characterize the neurons. And this is compared with the very synthetic ones, geometrically made. We now can use naturalistic stimuli through model fitting and as like suggested hypothesis for people to test. Okay? So the other project will be very brief. So we use the similar ideas, actually parallel, but in the end kind of related, to add stability to random forests, right? Random forest is another nonlinear method actually invented by my late colleague Leo Breiman. People call it machine learning, but it's very much by statisticians invented. So it's really statistical machine learning method has been really useful in genomics analysis. Like my co-lead Ben Brown has worked with random forests for 10 years, really liked the predictive performance, but it's very hard to interpret. So it's back to interpretability again, because if you look at the different trees, the paths just keep changing. We had Basu, who is now at Cornell, a postdoc, and Carl, who is the current student, really put us heads together and did this work. So the deep learning, remember my slide about brain and deep nets? There's some qualitative matching of the structure of the deep learning with cognitive processing, right? So that's important. But here, we have a different type of mechanism. So this is what we work with the Drosophila lab, that for development of Drosophila at the early stage, there's something called the French flag model, which means when the abundance of biomolecules, could be transcription factors and other things, hit certain level, things happen, segmentation happen, and pre-organs area get identified and organs get to grow, right? So it's about thresholding. The mathematical matching of that is Boolean functions, right? You have these different factors. This appeared, first in CART in the statistical invention, also C4.5 from the CS world, is decision trees. People say, well, if this feature is larger than that, something happened. So it's very interpretable again. And so we want to use this instead of deep learning, random forest. So what's random forest? You have decision trees, and you make many of them. How do you do that? You perturb the data, do subsampling, and you also random sample uniformly your features or gene expressions. And then you have many trees, and then you do some averaging. That's your final result. So what we did, I'll be very brief here, is called iterative random forest. So we basically load the dimensionality through weighting. We give importance measures for features. So the next step, we sample with weights. So we do self-dimensionality reduction. And we also do a lot of intersection of decision tree to stabilize. And we have an after loop of bagging to calculate stability score. So this enhancer case study, where we have 80 chip kind of predictors, and we have about 8,000 enhancer status through something called some reporter technique, become a classification problem. And we discovered 20 two-way interactions. And we went to the literature, and we were very nice surprised that 80% of them already physically validated by people who did two-way interactions. Right? So that was a nice prize. And for three-way interactions, it would be tested later because technologies become available. And you can see that this is just an example, that three-way interaction. There are three important genes, Giant, Kruppel, and Zelda. These are famous genes in Drosophila. And if Kruppel is low, nothing happens. Kruppel is high, then you can see interaction. So this is going back to data. You said, well, if it's in the data, we basically have a very computation efficient way to zoom into these relevant intersections without going through all possible computations, right? You won't be able to do that. And there's a theory bit to this, also Yuan is here, to connect stability with prediction, generalization error, and computability in terms of convergence rate. So Yuan basically formulate a new way to look at convergence rate so that you control the stability rate, unlike other ways, like you say, you have first order oracle and things like that. So use statistical means to control, reduce the algorithms and look at the convergence rate. It's a different way of doing this computational statistical efficiency trade-off than other people have done. So the paper is on the archive. So to summarize, I hope I show some evidence that stability added to predictability, computability could be very powerful. I showed you two examples. I'm also advocating a documentation to go with it. And I still want to point out that for both examples, even when we have big data, we're often in data poor situation because the complexity of things we try to understand. So it's not the number of data, it's really how complex you do. As Xiaoli alluded to earlier, we have been doing big stuff with data science education. Now data 8 is 1,300 students a semester, and data 100, I was on the team, is now 800 students. We have a new major, already people registering. We already got 50 students declared major, and we have an interim dean. So it's very much up and running, the education program. The key is co-design, co-teaching by CA and staff faculty with domain also a connection. So I'd like to thank my group and funding agencies. We do very slow research in my group, so I'm very grateful that I have students to work with. Even we publish a paper in science, in the scientific fields every 3 or 4 years. And to advertise what's coming up, we're writing up the paper on the 3 principles with Carl, and I'm working a book with another student, Rebecca Barter, to really try to synthesize and simplify how we teach statistics and data science, build on basic principles and very data-driven. And Becca drew this nice graph with stability as the root and computability as the trunk and other results, including prediction. We're also working on a paper on interval machine learning. We try to bring the strength, my group together, Jamie Chandon's here, and Riza and Carl, because my group is very diverse for statistics group. We have neuroscience subgroup, genomics subgroup, NLP subgroup, and precision medicine, and some theory. So we really try to put the strengths together to define what's interpretability, right? We heard a lot. but try to just have a few concepts well defined so can start more productive discussion about what we really want. Thank you.
We'll take a couple of questions. Jolie.
First, I have an invitation. Your 3 principal papers should be submitted to Harvard Data Science.
We'll talk about that later.
Okay. But I really like your stability formalized as the minimizing the gradient. But the only thing I'm worried about is whether you wanted to almost like have a little bit penalty, because if you do truly minimal, by throwing a lot of irrelevant model, the number is only driving down.
Exactly.
So if you're putting out some epsilon, you don't want
could
to
do that.
minimize. Give a little bit of, you can protect.
Yeah, that's something to, we have been working on that in different specific cases. We're just not ready to have a general recommendation yet. Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's where we actually have a new version for RF already called Sign RF, realizing RF is not quite the right framing. So it's very much, I would say, work in progress. I hope more people find it interesting and work on their own and give us feedback so we can do it together. I just think stability as robustness is very paramount importance.
One more question?
Yeah.
Very impressive talk.
Oh, thank you.
For the first visualization task on PCAs, on visualizing like the shape and the stability of those visual elements in the V4 layer, I was just wondering that because the input image now is simplified into a grayscale image, suppose we put like the traditional 3-channel or multiple channel of image, do we still see some form of stability? And those may be useful for like analyzing biomedical fluorescent images as well.
For what images?
So the main question is just about like for different color channel, do we
definitely
still see stability in terms of like different models?
So we're hoping that the way we're going tendency on the project, we now have movie color, movie data, and with a small population of neurons. So it's not trivial to say, now we have one function. You have to define modes of interest to drive a population of neurons. So that's not a trivial extension, but also color. Just because the data is kind of old, they didn't have color. So we missed the color characterization of V4, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.